Sonata-Allegro form, also just called sonata form, is one possible template for structuring a piece of music. Historically, it's a structure that's been used for the first movement of a symphony, but that's by no means a requirement. It can be used whenever and wherever a composer decides, of course. Now, I've never studied music formally, which is maybe why I still like it, but as a result, I learned what Sonata-Allegro form was by reading music websites, watching online lectures, that kind of thing, before I ever really tried to carefully listen to examples of pieces of music written in Sonata-Allegro form to see what's going on. And when learning about the form from reading and watching lectures, it seemed pretty typical to explain it in a certain way. And what's typically stressed is that Sonata-Allegro form is made up of three types of section. First, the exposition, then a development section in the middle, and then finally a recapitulation. The exposition is made up of two themes, two tunes. You have one tune. When that ends, there's a transitional passage of music that leads into the second tune, where the second tune is in a different key from the first tune. Then the section is often rounded off with a codetta. The development section takes any of the ideas from the exposition and breaks them up, extends them, rearranges them, puts them into different keys to create brand new music that still has a connection to the leading ideas of the piece, although it can actually introduce completely new material too. Then the recapitulation is broadly like a return to the exposition material, but with some changes, and the principal difference being that the two themes, the two tunes, that were in different keys in the exposition are now in the same key. Now, none of that is incorrect, and all of the examples I've shown on screen are useful learning materials. It's perfectly reasonable why the sources I've learned from choose to explain Sonata-Allegro form in this way. But when learning this explanation, I still felt slightly unsure about it. For one thing, the first section, the exposition, tended to be explained in the most detail, and then the development section and the recapitulation wouldn't be talked about as much. Yes, the overall function would be explained, but it felt like only the exposition was that tangible. So I'd come away feeling I could grasp 1/3 of what the structure looked like, while the other 2/3 still felt pretty vague. If I'm hearing that there are 3 sections, but I'm feeling only one of those has been explained to me in detail, then surely it remains that the majority of a piece written in Sonata-Allegro form is still unclear to me. Now, from what I'd learned, I knew that the development section and the recapitulation are both, in their different ways, based on material that's been established in the exposition, so I wasn't entirely in the dark. But some of the descriptions I'd read gave me the impression that each of these 3 sections was meant to be very distinct, and that made me feel like I wasn't understanding the full picture. And it also made me feel like writing a piece in Sonata-Allegro form would require a hell of a lot of material. I mean, how many separate ideas would you have to come up with in order to complete a full piece? So recently I decided to do what I really should have done earlier and carefully listen to a few examples of pieces written in Sonata-Allegro form, analyse them, and compare that to these common descriptions that much more knowledgeable musicians than me had chosen to use to explain the form. So here is the first movement of Mozart's Symphony in G minor, number 40. You'll know it, it's this one. And I've made a diagram of what's going on. Having looked at this piece, and having looked at others, I think my key takeaways are these. Firstly, that Sonata-Allegro form routinely contains 4 sections. It's perfectly legitimate to say that there are 3 types of section, but what you often get is 4 sections because the exposition is generally repeated. And usually it's an exact repetition, no variation, no differences in orchestration, just the exposition again. Of course, you don't always have 4 sections. Sometimes performers don't bother to repeat the exposition, even if there's clearly a repeat sign in the score, so you will just get 3 sections. Other times a piece may repeat the exposition and also repeat the development section and or the recapitulation. And sometimes the piece may have a long coda at the end, so you'll get 4, 5, 6 sections. But from my limited knowledge, 4 sections seems to be a common standard. Secondly, what I realised that I hadn't fully appreciated before was just how similar the recapitulation section is to the exposition section. In fact, personally, I find it more helpful to look at it as the same thing. It's the exposition again, but varied. And if we take this standard of having 4 sections, where we start with the exposition, we could label that A, then we repeat the exposition exactly, that's another A, then we get the development section, which is built out of the material from the exposition, but is undeniably a different section, so we'd label that B, and finally we get the recapitulation section, which I now like to view as a return to the exposition, but a modified exposition. So it's clearest actually to not label that as C, but as another A, but modified. So we'd probably go for A prime, which means that in its most standard form, by my judgment, Sonata-Allegro form is A, B, A, or really A, B, A prime, which suddenly feels a lot more familiar to me as a structure. It's no longer this esoteric concept from the highbrow world of classical music. It's suddenly something much more universal, natural, instinctive. When you come up with music, you start with your core idea, that's your A. You repeat it, because why not? Repetition is satisfying. Then you do something different, that's your B, because too much repetition gets boring, and you want your piece of music to feel like it's gone somewhere. And then you bring it back to your A to arrive home where you want to be, which is quite probably the defining music for your piece, the best bit, giving a sense of satisfying resolution. So Sonata-Allegro form, just a grander, more complex type of A, B, A. Then finally, I think my third key observation was that the development section quite often seems to be the shortest section. Not necessarily by much, and it certainly doesn't have to be the shortest, but it seems quite common. So to show you what I'm saying, but hopefully without labouring the point, I'm going to go through a few examples. Starting with this Mozart piece. Now, hopefully you can see how the observations I've already described apply to this piece. So what else can I pick out? Well, let's look at the recapitulation. The recapitulation is definitely following broadly the same arc as the exposition, as expected, but you can see that the paragraphs within it are extended. Theme 1 is exactly the same, but the transition is significantly extended, theme 2 is slightly extended, and the coda is also quite notably extended. The development section is notably the shortest section, but given that this piece is reasonably long, about 6 to 8 minutes in length, and it's quite complex, I chose to divide it up into a part 1 and a part 2. But now let's compare this piece to 4 other pieces, looking at the similarities and the differences. Let's have a look at another Mozart piece, K545, the second one down, and again I'll draw your attention to the recapitulation. Similarly, the transition is extended, but here theme 1, theme 2 and the codetta are all the same length as they were in the exposition. But remember, it's not perfectly the same, because here in the recapitulation, theme 2 will be in the tonic key. In the piece by Haydn, the next one down, the recapitulation actually has a shortened transition, but an extended theme 1. The second one from the bottom is a piece by Dvorak. It looks very similar in format to the top 3 until the recapitulation, which looks quite a bit different. Theme 1 and the transition are the same length as in the exposition, but then we get a very short theme 2 before going back into the transition, leading to a shortened version of the codetta, which then sets us up to go into a full coda, which rounds off the recapitulation. The Beethoven piece, the third movement of his third symphony, stands out as being the most different. In the diagram, I've depicted a version that doesn't repeat the exposition. Now in the score there is a repeat sign, so I guess strictly speaking it should be played twice. But given that the piece in this format is already upwards of 14 minutes, perhaps I can understand why some performances choose not to play it twice. The development section is huge. For the diagram I chose to break it up into 4 parts, mainly because it felt wrong to leave it as 256 bars of unspecified development. But really don't read too much into that, because these are very much my subjective judgments about how best to break it up, and I myself don't even take this partitioning too seriously, because in reality the music is fluid. It doesn't have these definite cut-off points. The ideas spill into each other, flow out of each other. But, for example, it felt reasonable to put a split between what I've called part 2 and the so-called part 3, because a distinct new theme enters at the start of part 3, a theme that has only appeared now in the development section and wasn't in the exposition at all. It also has a substantial coda, which is so substantial that I felt it needed to be categorised as a separate section, rather than viewing it as part of the recapitulation section, as I did with the Dvorak piece. This Beethoven piece then shows how expansive Beethoven can be in his writing, which here is stretching what Sonata-Allegro form can look like, but still upholding the fundamentals of the structure. And having looked at these 5 pieces, being able to see the similarities and see the differences, I personally, at least for myself, think these diagrams are useful. And by sharing my angle, I hope we're learning together more about what Sonata-Allegro form is in practice. Again, lots of the explanations that you'll find elsewhere are perfectly valid and are very useful in their own ways for explaining the form, but I don't feel they give the same impression that these diagrams do. Anyway, let's take it as a given that we aren't Beethoven and we're not quite at the point of composing on that scale. Instead, let's imagine ourselves writing a more typical piece in Sonata-Allegro form. Here is a table showing how much of that Mozart piece that we started with is made up of those different sections. And the 4 bits that make up the exposition, when you include the times that they're repeated, end up being 75% of the piece. Similarly, in the second Mozart piece we looked at, the exposition material is most of the piece, 83%. And the Dvorak, similar story, 74%. So, if you can write an exposition, you can use that to be 70% to 85% of a full piece of music in Sonata-Allegro form. And even though so much of the teaching material talks about these 3 sections, where the exposition is just one of those sections, actually the material that goes into your exposition can be most of the piece, if you want it to be. If you can just write an exposition, then Sonata-Allegro form gives you a blueprint for turning those ideas into a full piece of music. That's doable. Not easy, but doable. And so Sonata-Allegro form isn't just a thing for the likes of Mozart, Haydn, other famous classical composers. You can use it. So what are you waiting for?